Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer taking a look at How Nonviolence Protects the State by Peter Gelderloos, South End Press, 2007. The key idea of this text is that it is inaccurate to promote pacifism as a successful tactic. And when people claim that movements in the past, Indian independence, civil rights movement, anti-war movement, etc., were successful, they fail to address the larger power dynamics at play, and they fail to address the role violence, or the threat of violence by other groups fighting in the struggle, played in making the pacifist demands seem like a compromise to those in power at the time. And because of this inaccurate argument for pacifism, pacifism has become the dominant form of protest with no massive violent or violence-threatening groups to act as a counterweight. It appears modern pacifism is simply a pressure valve to let an enraged public blow off steam while actual changes to the status quo never occur. This text stands as a history and analysis of pacifism's shortcomings when compared to a history and the rationale of the stance of a diversity of tactics. Let's take a look at the book chapter by chapter. First, in the intro of the book, Gelderloos summarizes the text thusly: "This book will show that nonviolence in its current manifestations is based on falsified histories of struggle." Derek Jensen has made a similar argument, saying that pacifists put up what he calls a Gandhi shield, in which they hold their beliefs in the successes of King, Gandhi, Mandela, etc., to ward off critical thinking and analysis of their position. Gelderloos continues, "We are advocates of a diversity of tactics, meaning effective combinations drawn from a full range of tactics that might lead to liberation from all the components from this oppressive system." Chris Hedges has critiqued diversity of tactics, saying that it is a foolish excuse for rash behavior, and that we stand no chance against the state's military might, and that if we really wanted to change things, we must change it peacefully. Chris Hedges looks at Eastern Europe and the fall of the USSR as an example of this. I have found, however, that both with overwhelming popular support and violent resistance, movements have overthrown state power. Nonviolent groups have come in with popular support, walked into bases and disarmed state troops, and people have gone in violently and disarmed bases. What this tells me is that either option can work, and you have to think case by case, and so a diversity of tactics is key. Gelderloos goes on to argue that violence takes many forms, and so shouldn't be categorically banned outright, and that this book is not out to say that peaceful protests are dumb or peaceful protesters are dumb, but rather that violent protests should not be so quickly and uniformly abandoned. Gelderloos concludes the introduction thusly: "An ideal revolutionary activist would not be one who obsessively focuses on fighting cops or engaging in clandestine acts of sabotage, but one who embraces and supports these activities where effective, as one portion of a broad range of actions needed to overthrow the state and build a better world." Chapter 1. Nonviolence is ineffective. This chapter starts by explaining that it is easy to discredit this or that tactic as a failure, and so Gelderloos instead seeks to look for flaws in what have historically been considered successes for nonviolence, namely British colonial rule, caps on the nuclear arms race, the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and the peace movement during the war against Vietnam. Gelderloos clarifies this argument, saying, "The pacifist position requires that success must be attributed to pacifist tactics and pacifist tactics alone." It's easy to see where this line of logic is going, because if any change can be shown to have been motivated by pacifism and another form of action, then chances are good that both actions were needed for success, hence the promotion of a diversity of tactics. An argument I've often made is that once the dominant narrative takes hold of a movement's basic aspects, that movement changes. For example, as the civil rights movement made headway, it lost its strength to demand the economic changes that would have caused real racial equality. Or, as the anti-Vietnam War movement moved on, it lost the ability to demand systemic change that would have caused the military-industrial complex to come to a halt and made future imperialist wars impossible, etc., etc. In the same way, Gelderloos argues that Gandhi was only so known and so popular because the British press allowed it to be so. Essentially, pacifist leaders are held up by the dominant class as an acceptable alternative to the more radical aspects within the movement in question. After demonstrating that the largest perceived pacifist victories, Indian independence, civil rights, Vietnam, were not strictly pacifist, Gelderloos asks us to look at the anti-Iraq war protests, which, using this false history of pacifism's previous victories, were some of the largest demonstrations in the world, almost exclusively non-violent, and, lo and behold, completely ineffective. Gelderloos then gives an example of Jews in World War II. This type of example always makes me feel uncomfortable. I think it's unfair to the victims of the Holocaust to assume that as their rights were slowly taken away, they were expected to risk everything, the safety of their children and loved ones, to violently resist. Luckily, rather than victim blaming as some texts have done, this text simply congratulates those who did respond violently for their courage and bravery. There's a debate between Derek Jensen and Chris Hedges that covers this topic pretty well. Gelderloos concludes the chapter stating, "In the Holocaust, and less extreme examples from India to Birmingham, nonviolence failed to sufficiently empower its practitioners, where the use of a diversity of tactics got results. Put simply, if a movement is not a threat, it cannot change a system based on centralized coercion and violence. And if that movement does not realize and exercise the power that makes it a threat, it cannot destroy such a system." Chapter 2. Nonviolence is racist. This chapter is about how white pacifist culture celebrates pacifist leaders while ignoring the success of violent activists, and, to add insult to injury, white first world pacifists living in nonviolent circumstances are asking people in the third world, people in ghettos, people who live in violent circumstances to be equally nonviolent in response. Gelderloos states, "Nonviolence is an inherently privileged position in the modern context. Besides the fact that the typical pacifist is quite clearly white and middle class, pacifism as an ideology comes from a privileged context. It ignores that violence is already here." It reminds me of Ward Churchill mocking a pacifist letter about the WTO protests in Seattle, because the pacifists claimed that the violent protesters caused the police to be violent. To which Ward retorts, "Oh sure, the police saw rioters and then instantly went out and acquired riot gear, tactical formations, crowd control weapons, and military vehicles." Yeah, right. The reality is the police were already militarized, and the fact that white pacifists didn't notice from their suburbs is part of the problem of pacifism. Gelderloos then argues, as Derek Jensen and others have argued, that if pacifism is the best and most perfect and effective tactic, then Native Americans could have used it to thwart their genocide, or blacks could use it to have thwart slavery, etc., etc. These are obviously ludicrous claims. Gelderloos further argues the claim of racism, stating, "Nonviolence requires that activists attempt to influence power structures, which require they approach it, which means that privileged people who have better access to power will retain control of any movement as its gatekeepers and intermediaries, who allows the masses to speak truth to power." Gelderloos also argues, "At first, nonviolence seems like a clear moral position that has little to do with race. This view is based on the simplistic assumption that violence is first and foremost something that we choose." The chapter ends claiming that because systemic violence and oppression is what allows the perks of the first world white society to exist, then white activists should seek to push the boundaries on what is acceptable styles of protest rather than limit them. Chapter 3. Nonviolence is statist. This chapter is about how nonviolence assumes the state has a monopoly on the use of violence. Essentially, pacifists do the state's work by pacifying the opposition in advance. Gelderloos then goes into a brief description of how pacifists often claim that the state wants protesters to commit violence so there can be a crackdown, and that's why the state has agent provocateurs and encourages violent protests. Given that the security state and the vast wealth of money and resources it has, agent provocateurs, COINTELPRO, etc., have been proven to exist, yet at the same time the Occupy movement encampments were violently run out of town, I have to conclude that both options are true. The state is doing, as protesters should do, using the situation to determine the best tactics for their advantage. The state approves pacifism when it is convenient for them, and it approves violence when it is convenient for them. The opposition to the state should make similar judgments. Gelderloos then critiques the common claims that pacifism ensures state repression doesn't occur, and that protest messages are intact, when In reality, the state will fabricate reasons for violent reaction, and corporate media will never report a protest message. In fact, I believe the Occupy movement is a perfect example of this. A global protest with a simple message calling for an end to vast inequality, and yet the news wouldn't report the message, and in the end, the movement faced violent repression anyway. Chapter 4. Nonviolence is patriarchal. The standard claim is that violence is patriarchal because men are generally stronger. Yet Gelderloos claims that pacifism is patriarchal because it refuses to permit oppressed groups, women for example, to commit violent responses to violent oppression. Gelderloos argues, most of the work needed to overcome patriarchy will probably be peaceful, focused on healing and building alternatives, but a pacifist practice that forbids the use of any other tactics leaves no option for people who need to protect themselves from violence now. Gelderloos continues, the entire idea that violence is masculine, or that revolutionary activism necessarily excludes women, queers, and trans peoples is, like other premises of nonviolence, based on historical whitewashing. Gelderloos then quotes several violent female, trans, and other activists in the US and abroad. The chapter ends looking at the biological determinism argument that some people, many who would call themselves feminists, argue for, saying that violence is inherently masculine and pacifism is inherently feminine. Firstly, this is embarrassing because it is instilling the same biological determinism that feminism seeks to overthrow. Also, this argument ignores all the women who have fought back to protect themselves or loved ones. Chapter 5. Nonviolence is tactically and strategically inferior. This chapter critiques the strategies of nonviolent movements. Gelderloos claims that the four main types of pacifist strategies are the morality play, the lobbying approach, the creation of alternatives, and general disobedience. Gelderloos addresses and debunks each strategy. For example, the morality strategy seeks to educate, yet the general public is resistant to change under such circumstances, and Gelderloos gives the example of the Iraq War protests. Prior to the invasion, global pacifist protests took place all over the world. Lies about WMDs were widely known to be lies, and much of the general public knew there was no 9/11 connection. And yet, protests were peaceful in nature, and the invasion and the 10-year occupation afterwards showed how effective these strategies were. Gelderloos addresses the lobbying approach as essentially explaining that it is ineffective to try and work within a system that is corrupt and doesn't want to work with you and is used to ignoring you, etc., etc. Essentially, it reminds me of the arguments between radical unionism and business unionism laid out by Howard Zinn, Michael Parenti, and many others. Chapter 6. Nonviolence is diluted. This chapter is very similar to Derek Jensen's list of pacifist fallacies, such as violence begets violence, etc., etc. I've addressed these contradictions in reviews before, so I won't go into them here. I will slap up a video link of Derek Jensen laying out his arguments, so here's that. Chapter 7. The alternative possibilities for revolutionary activism. This final chapter concludes the argument from the text. Gelderloos argues that when we put all political action under the same tactics and strategies, then it is easy for powerful groups to co-opt the movement's message, and he demonstrates this with the so-called pacifist victories of the past, Indian independence, civil rights movement, etc. These movements' demands were not met. Rather, the so-called successes of these movements were strictly the successes the dominant class tolerated. Gelderloos goes into personal goals for what a successful movement means, namely revolutionary change involving destruction of centralized or hierarchical power and local communities autonomously deciding for themselves how to be organized. Gelderloos ends the book arguing that, in all, we must not manipulate ourselves into thinking this fight will be easy or that power will back down peacefully. He states, we must realistically accept that revolution is a social war, not because we like war, but because we recognize that the status quo is a low-intensity war, and challenging the status quo results in an intensification of that war. To finish my analysis, I'd like to explain how this text changed how I think. Coming to this text, I was already familiar with arguments against pacifism and the arguments for a diversity of tactics, having read Endgame and Pacifism as Pathology prior to reading this book. However, Derek Jensen's list of pacifist fallacies is specific to countering pacifism as an argument, and pacifism as pathology is simply an essay giving a thorough overview of the arguments being made. This text differs from those because it is about how pacifist victories are overstated and we owe their successes to their more radical compatriots, and that pacifism has severe unaddressed shortcomings which exist less in a diversity of tactics. This text acts as a history of the diversity of tactics in action and addresses the key shortcomings in pacifism and how diversity of tactics has outperformed pacifist action. If you're interested in radical theory, looking for a book recommendation or whatever, you can get your radical book reviews here with the Radical Reviewer. Thanks for watching.